One thing we love about the game of football, outside of the great individual games, are the great teams. We love to see them just dominate for an entire season and live the college football dream, which is why today I'm going to go over the 5 greatest teams of the last 2 decades, and I've got to narrow it down to the last 2 decades for a specific reason, because we have this great metric known as FPI, which is the Football Power Index, and we've only been tracking that for the last 2 decades, but it's interesting to see who the best teams have been from then. Now, the FPI goes from the low negative 30s to the upper positive 30s, with anything above a 30 to 31 being a pretty exceptionally good team, with teams winning the national championship in the past that have only scaled in the 24s and 25s. So, to give a pretty good example, we're going to go back to the most recent best team in college football with Ohio State University. They had a pretty tough schedule, with them having to go against number 3 Oregon, number 3 Penn State. They had number 5 Indiana come to them, and they walked out of those matchups 2-1, dropping a single game to Oregon, and then also lost a game at the end of the season in a depressing fashion in a 13-10 game against Michigan, as they simply forgot that they need to throw the ball to Jeremiah Smith as much as possible, having 2 losses, which usually will knock somebody out of being a contender for being the best in any particular season, but they did get to go in and face off against an absolute gauntlet of 4 top 10 teams in a row, and not just beat them, but made it look ridiculously easy, winning the national championship by double-digit points. But like I said, those little hiccups didn't keep them from being the highest scoring team of all time, but overall had them stacking up in the lower half of the index, rating in at 27.9, putting them in the bottom half of the great teams despite their strong finish. And obviously I think this whole thing is going to come with the asterisk of, I'm looking at how teams played holistically throughout the season, including their lows and their highs. So if a team was, slightly less disciplined and wasn't able to close out for an entire season, or didn't have the best game plan early on in their season, that's going to affect how I view them as a whole on like a coaching staff level, even if, like in the Ohio State thing, at the end of the season they seemed like nobody could touch them, it still is going to affect how I view them on a whole total scale. Because I do feel like what makes a team so great is something like discipline and game planning, which is something that's kind of a big spoiler for the team who's at number 1, if I'm going to be honest. But I do sympathize with you if you're going to make a case for a team being higher or lower depending on where their peak is, maybe instead of where their average is. And you're going to even see in some of my analysis that I might move some teams around or change how they are stacked up compared to some other teams, based off a little bit too of what I think their true peak is versus how consistently they played throughout. But all the teams at the top are pretty dang good. So why don't you just go ahead and tell me right now who you have your personal number 1 team in the last 2 decades to play, and why it's the 2018 Washington State Cougs. But moving on, we are going to have our 1 honorable mention, the 2013 Florida State Seminoles. Now these guys were just about as good as it's going to get, and the one thing you're going to notice about this whole top 5 is just how crazily dominant the best teams are. And even in starting us off, you're going to get a great understanding as the Seminoles open up with a 41-13 win over Pitt, then take it to the next level with a 62-7 win over Nevada before beating their FCS opponent and truly kicking off their ACC schedule with an asterisk. Yes, they beat Boston College, but it was a relatively close game against a not particularly strong opponent, as Boston would finish their season 7-6. And if you want to know why it's an asterisk, it's because they can do stuff like this when they took on a number 25 ranked Maryland and beat them 63-0, kicking off an absolutely dominant stretch that puts them in the conversation as they demolish a number 3 Clemson 51-14 before breezing past NC State and dunking on number 7 Miami 41-14. From here, we get to see them absolutely destroy teams. I mean, back-to-back 59-3 wins against Wake Forest and Syracuse. They'd play Idaho, who was still an FBS team, and would drop our one and only 80 bomb on them before playing against Florida in the rivalry week game and dominating them almost as bad as they dominate the ACC championship game against Duke, where they would be crushing them 45-17, posting a regular season record of 13-0 and not having a single one-score game and only a single 2-score game across their entire season, while having just some disgusting blowouts like dropping 80 on a team, which is something no other team on this list did. But where they fall somewhat short is in the national championship when they played down to their expectations and only won by 3 against an Auburn team who was good but shouldn't have theoretically put up as much of a fight as Florida State allowed them to. Which is why their FPI number being slightly higher than the number 5 team hopefully is something that you can still accept with me putting them here at the honorable mention with some of the stuff that I'm about to say later on. Which brings us to the number 5 team, and to understand who the number 5 team is, let's go back to 2018 Alabama. Now you should know that Alabama was going to show up on this list eventually in some iteration, but 2018 was a very good year for them. They would average 54 points a game through their first 8 games, as teams would once again realize that they were facing off against one of the better Alabama teams they would ever face. They would have 3 first-round picks hanging out in the quarterback room with Tua, Hurts, and Mac Jones. Their wide receiver room was stacked to the tits with Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, Jalen Waddle, and Devontae Smith. Their defense had 9 future NFL players on it, and man, when you watch them, it really showed. They would play number 4 LSU and not let them score a single point in their own house before taking on Mississippi State, who was also ranked, and doing the exact same thing. And while yes, number 4 Georgia would give them some trouble, which was also another very good team, being the 3rd strongest team this year in the FPI rankings, they had a deceptively close game against Oklahoma, which would leave them with a final score of 30.1 in the FPI, which is pretty much average for the best teams across the last 2 decades. And if you're wondering how I could even make the assertion that a very average best team is somehow above Florida State, I'm not making that assertion, which brings me to the actual team at number 5, which is going to be the 2018 Clemson Tigers. Now in 2018, Clemson was absolutely at their peak. It was the start of the Trevor Lawrence era. We believed that he was going to absolutely go crazy, and he did. His talent paired with Travis Etienne, Hunter Renfrow, Amari Rodgers, T. Higgins made their offense lightning in a bottle that pretty much no team could contain. On defense, they also had a stacked defensive line with Christian Wilkins and Dexter Lawrence, meaning that there was no side of the ball you could line up at where someone with the last name Lawrence wasn't going to be kicking your ass. So this led to them going on a similarly strong stretch of games as FSU, with their only close game being against a sneakily good Texas A&M team who would ultimately end the season ranked but weren't when they played, and a 3-point win against Syracuse. But this includes games like a 63-3 win over Wake Forest, a 59-10 win over Florida State, a whopping 77-16 win over Louisville, and handing their only 2 ranked matchups pretty handily, with a 41-7 win over a number 17 ranked NC State and a 27-7 win over a number 17 Boston College. And aside from those random 2 and 3 point wins, there wasn't a single other game within 20 points of Clemson, making those aforementioned games some slightly strange outliers. And why I'm giving them the edge over Florida State though is that the postseason against their best competition, they absolutely locked in and crushed Notre Dame 30-3. And when facing down the Alabama team that would be a very solid team in the best of the 21st century list right now, they would pretty much throttle them, where after a somewhat close half resulting in the Clemson beginning to pull away, they'd go into halftime 31-16, and then 2 unanswered touchdowns would bring it to 44-16, and that's how it would end, pretty much against a team better than anybody else that Florida State played. So yeah, I'm basically trading a slightly less dominant regular season run for a significantly more dominant postseason run against a much stronger team than anybody Florida State has faced, which is why I have them as a higher team, as their FPI index ratings comes to 32.7. So hopefully you all can see the vision too on that one. But bringing us into number 4 is a team that anytime you want to talk about some of the greatest college football teams of all time, you have to mention the 2008 Florida Gators. With Tim Tebow at the helm, Cam Newton as the backup, the 2-headed dragon in the backfield of Chris Rainey and Jeff Demps, a solid tight end in Aaron Hernandez, who surely will never be known for any controversy, as well as just a solid defense that you could ever want, with the icing on the cake being led by Urban Meyer, who surely will also be known just as a great coach with little to no controversy. but they were definitely an absolutely dominant team. Now, I'm going to throw in this little asterisk in their schedule because I'm going to make the assertion that in the early to mid 2000s, the general parity of college football teams was a little bit higher. Not only was the NCAA actively still handing out sanctions for recruiting violations like candy, but we were still feeling the effects of the SMU death penalty to a degree, with many of the coaches in that time being mindful of what had happened, so the talent on a team-to-team basis seemed a little bit more even and a little higher. Now, while you may assume that I'm going to cope and tell you how they were barely winning games, that's simply not the case. They were throttling teams. They beat Hawaii 56-10, Tennessee 30-6, Kentucky lost 63-5. Poor Citadel got the obligatory 70-point score dropped on them in a 70-19 affair, and those were just how they treated their unranked competition. When playing number 4 LSU, they would completely dismantle them in a 51-21 game. Then they would play number 8 ranked Georgia and thump them 49-10 before having to play number 24 South Carolina and kicking them immediately out of the top 25 by dropping a 50-point victory on them before taking their in-state rival in Florida State and absolutely throttling them heading into the SEC championship to have a handy 11-point win against a very strong Alabama team and then winning the national championship by 10 points. While they do have a big old 1-point loss to Ole Miss, that Ole Miss team was a very sneakily good team and just had a very tough schedule. They suffered a 2-point loss to a top 20 Wake Forest, pulled off a 1-point upset win against Florida, only lost by 4 to a number 1 ranked Alabama, and even beat a top 18 LSU and a top 8 Texas Tech in a very handy fashion. So for the reasons previously stated, the pure talent of the roster and their absolute dominance in an era of football, which I considered it much harder to actually truly dominate at that level at, that is why they earned a power index rating of 33.4, which is only slightly less than the team above them, the 2005 Texas Longhorns. So if you know college football, the Vince Young-led Longhorns being on this list should come as no surprise. They averaged 50 points a game, had a strong schedule, and then also dominated it. They beat number 4 Ohio State early in the season before truly beginning their tear with not allowing a team within 30 points of them for 5 weeks in a row, including number 10 Texas Tech, with only Oklahoma State breaking that up as they won by just 19 points, which must have set off some major alarms as they slaughtered Baylor 62-0, crushed Kansas 66-14, got into a dogfight with Texas A&M where they only won by 11, which set them up to take on Colorado in the Big 12 championship, in which case they dropped 70 points on them in their most dominating win of the season. And on top of the high power offense they had, their defense was no joke, with 4 starting defensive linemen all not just going to the NFL, but being draft picks, with Tim Crowder going in the 2nd round. And if you try to get away from their D-line by throwing it, every single one of their starting defensive backs would also get drafted, with them having 2 future 1st round draft picks with Michael Griffin and Michael Huff, as well as a 2nd round draft pick with Cedric Griffin. And while they were so incredibly dominant, one of the most impressive parts was how dominant the team they faced in the national championship was in USC. And while this national championship has been talked about to death, the reality is that it's a clash of 2 of the greatest college football teams ever, with USC having a power score of 32.2, even with their loss in the Natty, which would have probably put them in the honorable mention, and had that last play gone differently, it's very likely that we're talking about them instead of Texas in this spot instead. But beating a team of that caliber after the season that Texas had is absolutely why they're in this conversation, which must leave you wondering who on earth could possibly be better than them, which leads us to number 2 on the list. And to understand this very complex situation at number 2, we have got to go back to the season of giants, 2019. To set the stage, let's look at just Alabama, who's not even in contention for the best team this year, but had an index rating of 29.4, which would be a pretty average best team in the 21st century. This was also the only year that had 3 teams in the 30s. Those teams were Clemson, Ohio State, and LSU. Clemson's ACC schedule was arguably the weakest of the 3, not playing anyone of consequence outside of number 12 Texas A&M until late in the season with their matchup against Virginia in the ACC championship. But they would absolutely throttle everybody they played, with their closest game being a 21-20 matchup against Chapel Hill, with the top seeds being so competitive that still knocked them out of the number 1 spot despite winning it. And that was followed by their next closest game being a 14-point win over number 12 Texas A&M, and then from there on out it got bad. No one else would get within 30 points of the Tigers, and they would have 6 40-point victories, including a 45-point win over the number 22 Virginia in the ACC Championship. And on top of all of this, they had talent out the ass. Trevor Lawrence now a step ahead of where he was the previous season. ETN was also there, and T. Higgins and Amari Rodgers were proving to be a formidable combo, with their defense still being dang near as strong, but notably lacking Dexter Lawrence, which brought them down slightly. But that didn't hold a candle to what Ohio State did with a significantly harder schedule. With 5 top 25 teams in their path to the postseason, they would do similar levels of damage and arguably even worse. They would have no single-score victories. Their closest game was an 11-point win over number 9 Penn State, but this included them beating number 13 Wisconsin, who would be a very strong team in their own right, beating a good Michigan, Iowa, and Minnesota teams all this year. And Ohio State would take them to the house in a 31-point victory, and then again by 13 points in the Big Ten Championship. And that good Michigan team I just referenced got absolutely slaughtered 56-27. For some more impressive offensive performances, they put up 73 on Maryland and 76 on Miami, Ohio. They also had the talent to match that with Justin Fields, J.K. Dobbins, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, as well as just a stacked defense. Hence, why only 4 teams all season ever put up more than 20 points on them, with the final team in this giant year being the LSU Tigers, who easily had the hardest schedule of this year, opening up against number 9 Texas, then having to go through number 7 Florida, number 9 Auburn, number 2 Alabama, and when they got to the SEC Championship had to take on a number 4 Georgia, with Alabama and Georgia being the 4th and 5th strongest teams this year. So while their season consisted of a lot less blowouts than the previous 2 teams, there was no mistaking how impressive it was that they could make it out of that schedule completely undefeated and with some impressive wins like a 42-28 win over Florida, and at the end of the season absolutely throttling Georgia in a 27-point victory. But of course, with it cementing in stone that having a college with a future top 5 NFL quarterback throwing to not 1, but 2 future top 5 NFL wide receivers and a pretty good defense to back him up is a great recipe. But we got to settle who was the best in the playoffs when the gloves came off, and the Clemson Tigers, despite getting down 16-0 in the first half, would lead just a gut-wrenching comeback. So despite Ohio State coming into this appearing to be the better team, a horrible miscommunication in the waning seconds of the game by Ohio State ended up costing them the game, while on the other side of the bracket you would think Oklahoma owed LSU money the way that they were getting their ass whooped on public television. This game could have ended with a triple-digit score if LSU had wished, but they completely took their foot off the gas in the second half to only win 63-28. And when they had to play a gutsy Clemson team who had just knocked off OSU, it became clear that LSU was on a completely different level this season with a strong 17-point victory. Now, the strange part is that according to ESPN's ranking system, OSU had a 33.7 despite losing in the semifinals, and Clemson indexed in at a 31.5, and LSU only had a 30.3. But it is my true and honest belief that during this time period from like 2019 to 2022, winning this consistently in the SEC is just one of the hardest things to do in football. And of course, that's no longer the case, which is why everybody was making fun of Lane Kiffin for the way he was acting this year, but that's aside the point. Because LSU doing what they did in the regular season and then going on to do what they did in the postseason just showed how much better of a team they were than the rest of all other conferences were even prepared for. Which is why I'm kind of going to pass down OSU's index rating to LSU, because they slaughtered the team that beat OSU. And it is my, once again, firm belief that any team that would have played LSU in the postseason probably would have received this level of absolute ass pounding. But with all of that buildup, with all of those asterisks, who is the best college football team in the last 20 years, since 2005? And that is a title I'm going to give 2020 Alabama. Now this comes with a couple justification points, one of which being that just a year after LSU's dominating run in the SEC, Alabama would take it to the next level and would make it look like child's play. I'm talking about crushing a number 13 Texas A&M, demolishing number 3 Georgia, dismantling 22 Auburn, and their only close game the entire season was a 6-point shootout over the number 11 Florida Gators, with every other game hardly even being worth watching due to how fast and dominating the Crimson Tide were. They would also destroy Notre Dame in the first round of the playoffs and in the national championship when facing down an undefeated 7-0, yes, you heard that right, let's put a pin in that, we'll get back to that, 7-0 Ohio State team. They would effectively push them into a wood chipper in one of the most lopsided national championship games of all time. Now, for those ready to tear me to shreds due to what I'm about to talk about, don't worry, because we're about to talk about it. Because there was something weird going on this year, which is COVID. But instead of knocking them because most teams were facing an unreal amount of adversity, most teams, heck, weren't even playing full schedules, like Ohio State having to miss games and key players missing key playing time due to random COVID outbreaks. Which is why the rest of college football this year was somewhat floundering. I think it makes it that much more impressive that Alabama never skipped a beat, because it's always been attributed to the Crimson Tide that they were one of the most disciplined teams in college football, and always being smart, not taking unnecessary penalties, and playing good disciplined games, which made them that much harder to beat at any given point. But that was only ever a marginal advantage for them until it was coupled with COVID, which turned into an absolutely insurmountable advantage for Alabama. Not only did Mac Jones have a ridiculous year, throwing for 41 touchdowns and just 4 picks, but he was throwing to Devontae Smith, who would catch 23 of those touchdowns and win the Heisman out of the wide receiver position. But the ability to navigate the COVID landscape as well as they did, to perform at the level they did, is something that I don't think it's a large stretch to say maybe no other college football team in history could have done at the level they did it to produce the results they did, on top of them just also being a ridiculously talented team, which is why they have an index rating of 35.9 points. They are 2.2 points higher than the next highest team on this list, which is absolutely insane. But let me know who you think I missed when making this list. Who's the secret best team that I don't know about? As always, I'll be interested in looking at it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and peace.